This is the recording of a workshop held on March 7, 2021 on the topic of building bridges for racial equity. It is the last in a four-part series on racism and systemic bias, presented by the Interfaith Communities for Dialogue. The panelists for this program are Marty Swaim, founder of Challenging Racism, and Karla Bruce, Chief Equity Officer of Fairfax County, Virginia. ICD Chair Pami Sachdeva opens the program.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I hope you can hear me. Welcome to this fourth ICD workshop on racism. We've titled it Building Bridges for Racial Equity, and we are going to proceed with the presentation very soon. But before that, I'd like to introduce ICD. I'm the chair of ICD, and my name is Pami Sachdeva. I also come from the Sikh community. And we want to welcome our special welcome to the speakers. The two panelists are Marty Swaim, who's the founder of Challenging Racism, as you know, and Karla Bruce, who's the Chief Equity Officer for Fairfax County. So we are extremely honored and grateful to have them here with us today. You can see on the next slide, we're going to put it on, a few words about ICD, just to introduce the organization. You probably know some of you have been involved with us for many years. We've been in operation for about 16 years. It's a voluntary organization that was started by some of the founding members who are also still with us on the steering committee. I'll introduce them as well. ICD has 10 organizational members, which are listed on the left of the slide, and their names are given there. We come from 6 different faiths. It's the Christian, the Jewish, Muslim, Baha'i, Hindu, and Sikh faiths are represented in ICD. And each member organization sends representatives to the steering committee. So it's a very diverse group of people who organize and conduct these various activities. Most of our work is essentially based on voluntary activities, and we are focused on interfaith dialogue and projects. The founders, and you may know them, Mary Monson, who's now the chair emeritus and the vice chair of ICD, Geneva Pope and Fatima Pope, and they still work with us. And there are others as well, and we are extremely grateful to have their continuing service. The slide also tells you the mission of ICD. It's a network of interfaith, faith-based and associated organizations dedicated to promoting mutual understanding and positive relationships among diverse people in and around Fairfax County. We are active in 3 areas: interfaith education, interfaith engagement, and capacity building to continue that work. The main purpose of ICD is to facilitate mutual respect through interfaith collaboration. And we have currently, we are updating our strategic plan and our bylaws to respond to the changing circumstances around us. We have been interested in racism for a while. This is the 4th workshop. And as you can see, this focus on racism is consistent with our mission. We promote inclusiveness, integrity, and trust of all people. We stand in unity and support when any member of our community is targeted by disparaging or hateful words or actions. And we all believe strongly that people of all faiths must bear witness to and oppose the racial inequality and brutality that faces the people of color, particularly in this country. So in this workshop, we have 2 primary moderators. The first one is Fazia Deen. She's on, both of them are on the ICD steering committee. And Fazia has been facilitating all our workshops. She's from Guyana, studied in Canada and the US, is a lawyer by training, and is also the Deputy Outreach Director at Dar al-Hijra, the Islamic Center in Falls Church, Virginia. Her primary focus has been on combating racism through civic engagement and outreach. and her advocacy for equity and fairness and justice have led to a life of mentorship and coaching of particularly women and teens in the surrounding communities of Washington, D.C. So I'll ask her to start off with the rest of the program, and she will be joined with by Judith Shamir, you probably have seen, from 𝐿𝐴𝐻𝐻, and together they are the co-chairs or the co-leaders of our working group on racism. So I'll pass it on to Fazia. You can then introduce Judith as well. Thanks very much. Welcome all.
Thank you, Pammy, and good afternoon to everyone. This is a beautiful day for a beautiful subject because it's about bringing each other together and building bridges. So I love this topic so much, and I'm so happy to be in this space, that sharing this time with you guys. And time is an element that's very valuable, and here we are today, chosen to be here in this space. So without further ado, today, you all know, a lot of you already know me, Fazia from Dara Hijra. I'm the Outreach Deputy Director. I'm also an attorney by trade and hoping to go back to immigration law very soon, so stay tuned. And I would like to welcome you today and go over the goals for today. Many of you have been with us from the first webinar, or maybe just the second or third. Some of you have been with us for all 3 webinars, including today, which is the 4th of the webinar series. So here are some things we're going to go through today. We're going to review some key concepts and terms. So if this is your first time, hang in there. We are going to learn about efforts to disrupt systemic racism in our county and our community. And then we will formulate ideas together in rooms to engage ourselves and others in this effort. So let's roll our sleeves up because we have work to do today. Again, in reviewing the agenda for today, I don't know if everybody received an agenda, but we are going to go over key concepts and terms. Again, the panelist presentations, there's 2 panelists today. We'll have a panelist discussion, and maybe if we have time, Q&A, so you can send your questions in. And depending on how we're doing on time, we will look at those Q&As. And then we have a breakout session. Sorry, I'm looking at 2 different screens. Okay, so the panelist presentation, Marty Swaim and Karla Bruce. I will introduce them in a few minutes. And then the panel discussion, I will moderate a conversation with both speakers. And let's see, breakout session, participants will meet in small breakout rooms to share experience to date and future action ideas. So I'm looking forward to hearing from you on future action for sure. Breakout reports and panel discussion, we will reassemble after that discussion. And then each one of the groups will have a reporter who will report out briefly, summarize some key experiences and ideas that you had within your group, and the panels will discuss and respond to the questions. And I will facilitate those as well. And then there's a conclusionary space, and then a call to action. And then we can go about our afternoon full of energy and action. What's next? So our next housekeeping reminders, okay? Now, I know many of you, this is not your first show. You've all been here before, whether it's with ICD or other events, and we're all working towards challenging racism. That's why we're here this afternoon. Here are some housekeeping reminders. Things you need to remember. All microphones are on mute to avoid disruption so we can hear everyone and respect everyone. The workshop is being recorded and will be shared with others on YouTube and Facebook. And then submit your questions via the chat, and my co-lead, Judith, will facilitate those back to me. And I think that's it for now. You'll keep in mind, okay, just some other reminders is to keep in mind that the principles for active listening, okay, and engagement through this workshop. So keep an open mind, be accepting, bring your curiosity. We're here to discuss, and be sincere, and keep it short so that everybody can have a chance to share. And now I will turn it back to Judith Samir the member of the ICD steering committee and my co-leader in developing these workshops. Thank you, Judith, for being here and organizing us here today. And she's going to give us a brief review of what we have learned up to today. Thank you, Judith.
Thank you, Fazia. And I'm just going to share my screen so that I don't know if I can make it go on full screen, but hopefully you can see this. Just a couple of slides, and I think it's particularly appropriate to be holding this workshop today because the country is observing the 56th anniversary of Bloody Sunday today. And we're talking about building bridges, and this is when John Lewis and Martin Luther King and others tried to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge as they were marching in a peaceful demonstration to press for voting rights. And the violence and the brutality of that day awakened people to the fact that that something was terribly wrong and that and needed to be addressed. And we got the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And similarly, we started these workshops partly in response to George Floyd's murder and other events that were really bringing a lot of attention and awakening to these issues. And it gave us a really opportune moment to bring more attention to it. And so the 3 workshops we've done so far have been first on understanding racism, what we mean by that, what is racism and systemic racism, and getting some foundational principles. The second and third workshops, we focused on systemic racism and how it's manifested, how it impacts people in various systems of government and structures in our lives. So we did one related to education, police, and judicial systems, and another on systemic racism in health and housing. And in each case, we were looking at historical roots and current manifestations of racism in these systems. And in some cases, the issues were addressed broadly, things that are happening across the country. In some cases, we also got some data and personal examples of incidents within Fairfax County. So some of the concepts that we were looking at, which our 2 panelists will be talking about more today, so I'm not going to get into it a lot, but we did talk about racism as a social construct, that it's not biology based. We talked extensively about systemic racism having deep historical roots and persisting on 3 levels: the structural institution, which is what we've looked at most, where racial disparities just affect everything, every sector, and lead to differential access to services such as healthcare and schools, differential experiences and opportunities. And again, our speakers are going to do a great job telling you more about that, so I'll leave it to them. We did talk about personally mediated levels of racism, in which differential assumptions about abilities and motives lead to different actions based on those assumptions. And then we also talked about internalized racism, where people have a diminished sense of self-worth and accept the validity of those limitations. So our focus is mostly on systemic racism in these workshops. We'll be talking more again about societal forces that undergird these perspectives and how racism negatively affects the whole of society by wasting human resources. And this is one reason that it's really critical for us to do these workshops and educate ourselves and others about how to fight racism for all of us. So today we're going to be talking about these efforts to combat systemic racism, especially in our county and community, talking about opportunities for continued engagement, and in our breakout discussions, creating plans for ourselves and for our communities on how we can take some action to plan to disrupt racism. So I will stop sharing my screen and turn things back over to Fazia to get us really into the meat of our discussion. Thanks.
Great. Okay. Can everyone still hear me okay? We're so good. I think we're moving right along. I think at this point in time, I'm getting ready now to introduce our panelists for today, and I'm really excited. This is in no order. We only have 2 panelists, and I'm going to introduce Marty Swaim first. I would like to say that Marty Swaim is a co-founder of Challenging Racism, an Arlington-based educational NGO. She is a retired Arlington Public School social studies teacher, a lifetime National Education Association member, and a 2-time president of the Arlington Education Association, and a teacher consultant from George Mason University Writing Project, in addition to a BA in government from Oberlin College and an MA in American History from Howard University. She's a certified facilitator in results-based facilitation and has held Virginia certifications in secondary teaching and administration. I want you to know that both of these panelists have their own pages. So I'm just going to read probably just the first part of their intro, and we'll have it available for you guys so you can see their full bios. I also want to say that I'm a lucky graduate of one of her Challenging Racism classes, and I'm very blessed to be here and have her in my company today with all of you. We will also be hearing from Karla Bruce, who is a dedicated public servant with more than 20 years of experience leading efforts to address the most challenging social issues facing communities. She currently serves as the Chief Equity Officer for Fairfax County, Virginia. And since she's taken that position, I've seen her in many meetings. She's very diligently at work for us. And in that role, she provides overall management of One Fairfax strategic framework by serving as the county's racial and social equity liaison, engaging stakeholders and partners, and advising and supporting the Board of Supervisors, executive leadership and department leadership in shaping and directing policy and practice to create equitable opportunity for all Fairfax County residents. That's all of us, guys. So again, she also has a complete full list, and I can go on, but in the essence of time, I'll leave that to you guys to look up. And without further ado, I will let Marty be the first of the speakers to embellish this afternoon. Welcome, Marty. Thank you.
Thank you. Am I live?
You are live.
Oh, there we go. Okay. Thank you very much. And thanks for inviting me, and thanks for the time commitment. And I have to say, I struggled to manage 15 minutes. This is a big subject, but we're going to get to work. So I invite you to consider with me the white assumption of superiority that underlies racism, namely the basic idea that Black people are lesser. This is the powerful 400-year-old foundation for all racism and its fruits. You've been looking a lot at the fruits of racism. I feel like to undo racism completely, the foundation of white beliefs about Black people and other people of color need to be undone. Before we begin, I want to underscore that I personally undertake this conversation about whiteness not out of some ideas of political correctness or some kind of cancel culture or interest in blame, but to support the shared humanity of all of our fellow men and women, and in the hope of building a truly just and beloved community. I believe we can write a new story of who we are as Americans, all of us together. And then I'd like to also ask you to think about my basic assumptions in having this kind of conversation about race. Learning about and understanding racism is a lifelong journey. In order to survive, of course, Black people and others of color have been on this journey of understanding racism since they became conscious beings. But white people don't need to know that a journey on racism even exists. So you're really, I appreciate very much that you have already taken the plunge and started on that journey. The ideas and facts of whiteness, white privilege, and white superiority are not a description of the character of any white person or white people. These words simply name what is, whether white people know about it or not. And now with those understandings, I'd like you to think with me about a really dramatic, very recent example of white assumptions of superiority. Think back to election night, November 6th, when Phoenix, Detroit, Madison, Las Vegas, Atlanta, and Philadelphia came in late for Biden. In that very moment, Trump and his white voters saw in flashing lights, cities with Black votes equals corrupt. Trump immediately named the election as stolen by these late city votes that he called fraudulent. Now, he didn't say stolen by Black people and Latino people, but the audience knew what he meant. Stop the Steal was the name for this racist argument. The thinking goes like this: Black votes are fraudulent because cities with Black people must be poorly run and incompetent and corrupt, because Black people are believed to be lesser. That racist perception about Black people is where we are now. I think history provides a guide to how we got here and what we need to change. The lie that Black people are lesser beings has been remarkably resilient for 400 years, nationwide to this very day. The lie was framed and started in 1619, Point of Rocks, Virginia, when the first boat of Black Africans unloaded. James Baldwin wrote, "The people who settled this country had a flaw, a fatal flaw. They could recognize a man when they saw one." Speaking of a Black man who stepped off of a boat from Africa in 1619 to be sold, they knew he wasn't anything else but a man. But since they, the settlers that is, were Christian, and since they had already decided that they came here to establish a free country, the only way to justify this role this chattel was playing in one's life was to say that he was not a man. For if he wasn't a man, then no crime had been committed by owning him. And that lies the basis of our present trouble. Two periods of colonial of our history built this lie. One is colonial America through the Civil War. And then after the Civil War, that lie continued to be supported on two tracks simultaneously. One in the South primarily, and the other in the entire United States, in many, many areas of government. The foundation of this lie in its very beginning is greed. In 1619, the white men who bought Black Africans wanted cheap labor, and enslaved Black Africans were cheap labor. These men were greedy. Most colonists, in fact, used free labor. But the greedy choice really worked for those people who made it. Many Englishmen came here with little and sometimes nothing, and by selling Black Africans and using the labor of enslaved people, struggling Englishmen often became millionaires in 1 or 2 generations. The other part of this, the next step in this process is socialization. And maybe if you've got that slide, you could put it up. I'm going to read it. Americans were socialized to see slavery as normal. And this is a process that goes on all the time. I'll start reading, and if the slide appears, that's fine. Socialization is the process of being trained into our culture, learning the norms, meanings, and practices that enable us to make sense of the world and behave appropriately in a given culture. We are taught these norms in many ways, and socialization begins at birth. Now, in colonial America, our socialization to the idea that Black people were lesser and it was all right to hold slaves was really built by lots of different kinds of people. Powerful people owned slaves. 12 presidents of the United States before 1865 had slaves. They came from Indiana, Louisiana, Massachusetts, Tennessee, and Virginia. Big landholders and small farmers and businessmen used enslaved people. In New York State, Philip Schuyler, the wealthy New York Dutch father-in-law of Andrew Hamilton, owned 40 slaves for farming along the Hudson River. Tobacco growers in the Connecticut River Valley, the shipbuilders in Rhode Island, and the New York City docks all used enslaved labor. Slavery was normalized. Owning slaves was unremarkable. And then finally, in this period, the big boys in the society, the leading men supported the lie. In the law, our first law, the Constitution, acknowledged slavery and its practitioners when the document provided the states which had the most slaveholders more votes in Congress based on 3/5 the number of slaves they held. Enslaved Africans were also one of the first items, you'll be pleased to know, to be mass marketed. The continued selling of enslaved people was justified by pamphlets and books and newspapers, every method of communication that was available in that period of time that asserted that all the reasons why African Americans were only fit for being enslaved. They were portrayed as animals, among other things. The great majority of white people, North and South, didn't own slaves, and yet this socialization was so powerful that they accepted that lie that Black people are lesser. And even when the North abolished slavery, white Northerners segregated transportation and housing. And simultaneous to all these, going on at exactly the same time, is the political usefulness of making the pitch that when Black people are up, white people are down, or vice versa. So politicians found this very useful. Very early in the late 1600s, American politicians and wealthy elites broke up any ties between working white people and Black people. In Virginia before 1700, the first laws on the status of free or enslaved people regulated and prohibited marriage, businesses, or political activity between Black Africans and white English people. And they assured that any child born to a woman who was enslaved, no matter the father was free, was a slave child. Now, there were resistors among Pennsylvania Quakers and Mennonites who argued for the Golden Rule. The first active resistance, of course, was the abolitionist movement, 1830 to 1878. The second stage of this oppression of Black people happens after the abolition of slavery. And it's both Southern and national, and it involves really the federal government changing sides. So at the beginning of the Civil War, of course, and at the end, and through the Reconstruction, the Union was supporting Black rights to vote and various other ways in which Black people could achieve some opportunity. But in 1878, that whole effort was abandoned. So let's start with right at the end of the Civil War. White Confederate soldiers left the armistice and they directly undertook a very thuggish guerrilla warfare against freedmen in their home states. This didn't wait until the time that the Klan started. This was immediately from day one. They became paramilitary groups and Klan leaders and members. Effectively, the Union won the war of guns, but the South won the war for the control of Black citizens and for the care and development of the lie about Black people. In 1878, then, white Southerners who came to power when Union troops left established what can only be described as authoritarian governments. These state and local governments were run by former slaveholders. They segregated Black people with Jim Crow. They denied the vote, property rights, and education, and they built a whole system of labor that was rested on the false arrests of Black men. From 1900 to 1970, the violence against Black people was so intense that 6 million Black people fled to the North, hoping to find physical safety and work. And that violent pattern has continued not only in the 20th century, but in the century that we're living in right now. And then when the government changed sides from supporting abolition and Black rights to denying them, Blacks were largely excluded from the Federal Homestead Act, from the New Deal federal programs that were administered by states and local governments. They were kept out of mortgages, from FHA, from workmen's compensation, from federally run Social Security. And then right in the middle of the Civil Rights Movement, urban redevelopment and the federal highway system destroyed most of the wealth, or much of the wealth that had been accumulated by Black people with great difficulty. Of course, the lie continued and it outlived the Civil Rights Movement. Lyndon Johnson was the legislative leader for voting rights. And you know that list: public accommodations and also desegregation for fair housing and getting rid of legal segregation in every area that we possibly could. He was also the last Democratic president to receive the majority of white votes. I think it's fair to say that the Civil Rights Movement never had the support of the majority of white people, at least to the degree that that's evidenced by how they have voted. The lie went underground during the Civil Rights Movement and after, and then it emerged with new varieties of coded racial appeals called dog whistle politics, school busing, law and order, welfare cheats, drug dealers, predators. All of these became shortcuts for talking about Black people. It's true that the end of legal segregation provided all kinds of opportunities for Black citizens that they had never seen before. Black people have turned this into progress for maybe half of the Black and brown people in the United States, even though disparities in wealth are still very great. But about 1/2 of the Black people in America are still underclass, left behind in cities and in very rural areas. Now, the dialogue that we're all part of here states that a goal of these conversations is to build trust, cooperation, and caring within and among diverse people. I believe that to reach this goal, we need to be honest with each other. And of course, that's part of the reason to have this discussion about history, just to demonstrate how widespread and very, very deeply kind of in our reptilian brain, these ideas are implanted. I think we have to be honest about white assumptions of superiority and the lies about Black people, and then we can plan how to challenge them. I would like, just in the few minutes that are left to me, to use the experience of Black children in schools to examine how ideas of white superiority impact children and what we might do to eliminate gaps and build the success of Black students. Achievement or opportunity gaps are simply intolerable. Now, let me say at the outset of this discussion, I'm going to suggest 1 or 2 very specific things that all of us can do. But it is true, of course, that permanently eliminating gaps requires a few core changes that all students need. And I have to say this, as a teacher, elementary class sizes of 15 to 20, which are substantially less than what you have in Fairfax County. Top pay for teachers. All elementary teachers should be reading teachers. All students on grade level by grade 3. You and I can fight for all those things, the public school standards that are used in all of the developed world except the United States. But today I want to talk about one thing that we can change right now, very briefly. It's a modern day result of the lie about Black people in the life of any Black student in our communities and schools. This is about comments that we might do or say that are very unthinking that we can learn not to do. So what is the community and the school like for a Black student on a daily basis? Living in a society that communicates in many ways that Black people are lesser constitutes a constant threat to the existence of a Black student. This life experience of the lie forces a struggle for a Black child to develop a positive personal identity and a positive racial identity. We all of us develop our identity based a great deal on who the people in our lives say that we are. Again, James Baldwin, he wrote, "I'm talking about what happens to you as a parent if you watch your children growing up, and no matter what you do, you're powerless. You're really powerless against the force of the world that is out to tell your child that he has no right to be alive. No amount of liberal jargon and no amount of talk about how well and how far we have progressed does anything to soften this dilemma. In every generation, ever since Negroes have been here, every Negro mother and father has had to face that child and try to create in that child some way of surviving this particular world, some way to make the child who will be despised not despise himself." I don't know what the Negro problem means to white people, but this is what it means to Negroes. The illness that threatens Baldwin, Black parents, and their children is the indirect and direct effect of behaviors of white people who believe in a lie or who unwittingly, unthinkingly show that Black people, that Black people, including students, are lesser in some way. Just one simple example. Black teenagers walk in a group down a street near Wakefield High School in Arlington, coming home from school on a sunny day, talking and laughing. They notice a white person further down the street who approaches them, examines them from a distance, and then suddenly crosses in the middle of the block to the other side of the street. To the teenagers, it feels like that white person is afraid and likely assumes that they're bad kids. That's how it feels. And the message is, Black men or boys must always be watched and they may be dangerous. It doesn't really matter what the white person's intent was. This is the impact that it has on these kids. One more example. In Black History Week, a white student asks a question about Black Lives Matter, and the teacher turns to the 2 Black students in the class and says to them, "Could you please comment?" And what that feels to those kids is these 2 Black students represent all Black people, and the teacher doesn't see them as individuals. Again, it doesn't matter her intent. What happens is the impact on these students. The personal insults for Black people and assumptions made about them are often called micro and macroaggressions or abuse. We can learn not to do them, to become aware and to apologize when we do such harm. Daryl Sue, S-U-E, is the guru on this subject, and he's on the web, great interviews, lots of good material, just look him up. These abuses wear down people of color and contribute to high rates of depression and chronic illness. They are one source of anger in communities of color supported by Black Lives Matter and others. Kids of color have the best school scores and general success when they live and go to school in communities where there are adults who pay attention and give them positive feedback. These places are called opportunity zip codes in the research by Harvard economist Raj Chetty. Wish that we all were living in opportunity zip codes. What might that look like to be an adult in our communities who pays attention to students of color and of course other students? Chetty describes the importance of simple things like always greeting students on the street and where you shop, being respectful, not crossing the street to avoid them, show civic pride in student accomplishments of all kinds, and assisting that schools have good landscaping, construction, maintenance, make it a place that's really, really important to all of us. And one final thing we can do for schools, make sure that every teacher hired for your schools knows what you know, that the experiences with students of color have every day tell them that the lie about Black people is alive and well. Kids were watching that election, November the 6th. They know what it said. They know what the claims that were made were about. They live in the world. A teacher's job includes pushing back hard against that lie. Many white teachers of Black students and others of color have been swimming in this big world of white unconsciousness bias for their lifetime.
Okay.
Just like we have. Training costs money. Put it in the school budget.
They can't even tell.
Thank you very much.
Marty, my head is swimming. That was brilliant. I love that you did the historical really fast, because you did have a lot to talk about there, and bringing it back to today and even future tasks for us and for teachers as well. So thank you so much for that. And without further ado, we're going to get Karla to jump in and tell us a little bit about Fairfax 1.
Actually, one Fairfax.
One Fairfax.
One
Sorry about that.
That's fine. That's fine. I am going to share my screen, so just give me a moment. Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for pairing me with Marty, because I think she laid an absolutely valuable foundation for why one Fairfax. And as I was introduced, I am the county's Chief Equity Officer. That's a new role just established when I came into it with a charge of advancing racial and social equity in Fairfax County. So in my few minutes today, I want to sort of take some of the things that Marty shared with you and give you a more local context, because we see those same inequities and disparities in Fairfax County. They are connected to the same history that Marty shared with us. And I want to sort of leave you today with hopefully an understanding of how you can be a part of the work of advancing racial and social equity. So with that, I will begin. So I'm going to begin with a map from a report done a few years ago by the Northern Virginia Health Foundation. It was called the Getting Ahead Report, the Uneven Opportunity Landscape in Northern Virginia. It was funded by Northern Virginia Health Foundation and conducted by the Center on Society and Health at the Virginia Commonwealth University. This is a map of Fairfax County. Hopefully you recognize it. The yellow areas were identified in this report as quote unquote islands of disadvantage. These are areas where there are concentrations, higher concentrations of people of color and higher concentrations of people who aren't faring as well when it comes to sort of all the indicators of life success, whether that's education, whether that's health, whether that's economically, jobs. So these are areas where, coming from my background, while I've only been in the role of Chief Equity Officer for about 3 years, I've been working for Fairfax County for 21 years. And I worked primarily in the field of human services. And when we looked at areas of the county where we knew that there were going to be what we called hotspots, it was always these yellow areas along the Richmond Highway corridor, in the Bailey's Crossroads, Seven Corners area, parts of Annandale, parts of Herndon and Reston, now parts of Centerville and Chantilly. And so, but these are areas where, you know, for years, we've been working very hard as a county to address need at the individual or family level. But what this report really pointed out, and other similar reports pointed out, is that yes, there are opportunity and vulnerability variances depending on who you are and where you are in the county, but that those variances really shouldn't be looked at the individual level. It shouldn't be attributed to the people who happen to live there. In reality, the reasons that we're seeing these inequities are really structurally based. And so if we're going to be effective in addressing them, our approaches have to not just focus on individuals, but on the institutions and the systems that are producing systems in structures in the community that are contributing to this variance in opportunity and vulnerability. And really, when we think about opportunity, ultimately, all of the opportunities, you know, whether that's education or health or childcare, and we'll talk a little bit more about all these things later, that they all really work together to foster the ability to participate in an inclusive economy. And so our hope is that we are building opportunity and connecting people to opportunity and community in ways that facilitate economic mobility. So just to build a little bit on what Marty shared with you earlier, racism is grounded in the history of our country. And we can look at over time how it's really manifested itself. So first, I'm sorry, I got a little ahead of myself. Let me go back. So first, let's think about it initially. There was a period in time when it was explicit, right? Racism is an explicit manifestation. Slavery is an explicit manifestation of racism. This poster here is from the World War II period, and it's a poster relating to Japanese internment camps. This too is an example when the United States very deliberately and intentionally utilized the power and authority of government to assign advantage or disadvantage to groups of people based on their race. So as we think, again, following the history that Marty laid out for us, when you think about later and you think about the civil rights movement, that period is really, and it's important to say, it wasn't as if the United States sort of woke up one day and decided things were going to be different. It came through the activism of people in the community, and particularly people in the faith community, which is, I think, really important, thinking about the work that you all are doing here today, really organizing and activating the faith community. But we began to pressure the government to institute policies and practices that would ensure that those explicit acts of racism were no longer legal. And so we saw that in how we looked at fair housing. We saw that as we looked at as it relates to ability to get jobs. But what happened is, by not really considering race and adopting more race neutral policies, without intent in some cases, the same injustices continue to occur. We see that with, policing policy, and we see that with things when the old 3 strikes and you're out policy. Which populations did that impact most? We see that when we saw the discrepancy in the population of sort of the different forms of cocaine, powder cocaine, which was used primarily by white people, compared to crack cocaine, which was used primarily by Black people. the crack cocaine epidemic was addressed much more harshly than the use of powder cocaine, right? So those are things where it started to, there were policies put in place, but they still had a disproportionate or disparate impact on the population based on race. So where we find ourselves now is in this period where government has to acknowledge the historical harm caused through inequitable policy and practice. And its government really focused on advancing equity. So we're a member of an organization called the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, one of about 270, I saw at last count, jurisdictions from across the country who have made a commitment to proactively develop policies and practices and procedures that advance racial equity, but also to look at the historic impact of policies and practices on people of color and seek to try and address those harms that have been created. And so that's really the foundation of the work of One Fairfax, is this understanding that government has to play a role in advancing equity, because so much of the inequity we've seen in our community is based on the power that government was able to exercise in the formation of our society, in the formation of our systems, in our structures, in our landscapes through government policy and practice. And so the way that Fairfax County has sort of taken this work on is through the adoption of the One Fairfax resolution and One Fairfax policy. It was adopted by our Board of Supervisors. First, the resolution was adopted in 2016. It was followed by a policy in 2017. And in a nutshell, it commits the county government and the schools to consider equity in all of our planning and decision-making. It is not a program in and of itself. I don't like to think of it as an initiative, because initiatives to me sort of start and end. This is really a way to think about how we govern and manage the county. It's our approach to doing our work and gets embedded through how each of us at different levels of government act in a way that is informed by the inequities that we see. It involves facing our history. So right, again, Marty laid out a great historical foundation for our discussion today. That history is a national history, but it's a local history as well, because we have to realize how our history has resulted in the conditions we see in the community today.
If we need to go.
And then based on what we see today, we have to say, are we comfortable with the current arrangements? And if we're not comfortable with the current arrangements, we have to think about what we want to see in the future and be very intentional and set priorities and make explicit choices and be bold and innovative in the types of things that we do that can dismantle the inequities that have been produced over time and then create a more equitable path forward. And we do this with the partnership, support, and will of the community. So again, I just want to congratulate the group of you who are leading this effort and really, look at it as an opportunity, hopefully for you all, not just to learn something new, but to become more mobilized as a faith community in ways that can advance this work. And so, as I mentioned, we're a member of the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. And as a member of that alliance, we are following their framework for change. And their framework for change is fairly simple. It's normalize, organize, and operationalize.
Do we have any questions?
Oh. And so normalize is normalizing conversations about race. The history that Marty shared with you is not a history that many of us learn going to school. Even in this work, I've learned new things about the history of our country that really relates to some of the conditions that we see today. So it's important to normalize conversations about race. It's important to normalize this look backwards at our history so that we can appropriately organize in the government, organize in the community, in ways that will allow us to operationalize strategies and activities really focused on achieving a vision. And again, for Fairfax County, that vision is One Fairfax. So what is equity? We know that from infant mortality to life expectancy, race predicts how well you will do. We've seen this in the last few sessions. I've been fortunate enough to at least participate a bit in the first 3 sessions of this series. And so you all have seen real examples of how inequity is present in health, in criminal justice, in education, in housing. We have evidence of this. And what we're seeking to do is achieve racial equity. And that's when you can no longer predict advantage or disadvantage by race or by group identity. And our goal is to, at one hand, improve outcomes, especially to improve outcomes from the groups who are most negatively impacted by current policy and practice, and close racial gaps, right? So that, again, it's no longer predictable that across most indicators of life success, people of color, and specifically African Americans and Latinos, are faring worse, and white people are typically faring better, right? That's a predictable trend in our society, and we're seeking to address that. You've probably seen a version of this slide before, and I just wanted to share it because I think it's important to illustrate our focus on equity. So in the other slide, you've probably seen a comparison of 2 groups of kids trying to see a game. And those kids are standing on boxes. And what happens to make the difference between equity and equality is that if you give everybody one box, are you able to address the situation of those individual children? The challenge with that graphic is that those individual children are of varying heights. And it suggests that there's something deficient, there's something different inherently in the individual children. From a One Fairfax perspective, what we're looking at is not the differences in people. What we're looking at is the differences in the very structures in which they live. So it's about a balanced understanding. Yes, there are individual differences in people, but we also have to recognize that it's a set of systems and structures that produce inequitable outcomes. And as the government, what we can control are the systems and structures. And that's what our focus is. The other thing is that we also want to recognize it's not about scarcity. It's not about taking from one group to give to another group. It's about recognizing our shared humanity and our shared need for support from the government, right? So the government supports different people in different ways, right? And so homeowners are supported by the government in some ways. You know, as we get older, we're supported by the government in different ways. So the idea is that everybody needs some level of support. The way that we arrive at what level of support is necessary is we look at the foundation. You see the difference in this picture. The people are about the same size. They're in the same relative condition. What's different is you see a sloped fence, you see a graded ground. And that's really meant to represent an unjust system and structure. So to the degree that we can't make changes to that unjust system and structure, we look at what targeted interventions we can do that enable people to be able to achieve their goals. Very quickly, and this is just, you probably are already familiar with this, but this is a resource that I wanted to share because, you know, we've each been given 15 minutes to go through information that could take hours, days, in fact, years to really grasp and understand. But I would offer, if you are not familiar with this documentary series, Race, the Power of an Illusion, that you take a look at it, because I think it does a great job of talking about race as a social construct and also how it has served to really assign advantage and disadvantage in our society. It's available online through Vimeo for a nominal fee. But I will say that we've made it available to all county employees for free to stream so that they can, again, get a better understanding of things that we thought were sort of the truth, right? Sorry. That we thought were the truth. So, we've been taught something about our community, about our history, and in some cases, it's important for us to unlearn it. And I think that this documentary is a great opportunity to insert some new information. A more recent example was something that was done by the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and they have a great website. Again, I'm not sure that if you are not already familiar, I would strongly suggest some of these concepts that we're just introducing today. If you're interested in digging in more and learning more, I would highly suggest checking those out. So Judith mentioned this early, but again, our focus here is not at that individual level of racism. We all acknowledge that that's not right. We don't want to see that in our community. But what we're really looking at is how policy and practices have been infused with racism and are therefore producing inequitable outcomes. So our focus for One Fairfax is at the institutional and structural racism level. And when you think about institutions, you can think about, education and transportation and health, and how all these institutions kind of come together and start to form structures in the community. And those structures can then become barriers. And so we're looking at racism sort of in the at the individual institutional level, but also how the various institutions that are supported by government are coming together in ways that are producing structures that serve as barriers to opportunity. And so in closing, I just wanted to talk a bit about how we are operationalizing. So as I said, we're normalizing, organizing, and operationalizing. And one of the ways that we're operationalizing is through the county-wide strategic plan. And if you think back to that map that I showed you at the beginning in those yellow areas, those yellow areas were named by that report islands of disadvantage. We'd like to think of those areas as communities of opportunity. Marty mentioned this briefly in the work of Raj Chetty, but we want to look at those areas and figure out where we can bring opportunity where it doesn't exist, where we can create access to opportunity where there might be barriers, and where that opportunity is really creating pathways that lead to people's ability to fully participate in our economy and our society. And so the way that we are doing this across the county government is through our strategic plan. So I'll just quickly talk to you a little bit about that. That process was started pre-pandemic. And obviously, when the pandemic hit, we had to sort of stop and focus on sort of the basic operations and the basic safety of the county. But what we saw were these persistent inequities. When we saw who was being impacted most by COVID-19, both from a public health perspective and an economic perspective, it was people of color. And when you looked at where those people were most impacted by COVID-19, it was in those same areas that I highlighted before, those yellow areas. So even though the strategic plan, we couldn't sort of focus on it as a sort of central way, we did have to acknowledge that we couldn't just, try and meet the COVID challenge without this lens of equity. And so now, in the testing phase, we had to focus on equity. And now that we're in the vaccination phase, we have to focus on equity. And so this strategic plan really was intended to represent sort of what's important for Fairfax County success. Today, as well as 10 or 20 years from now. But as you look at each of these elements, we have to acknowledge how people are faring within each of these elements. And so that's where our equity approach is being embedded. It's in how we're thinking about our success. And we do that through a concept called targeted universalism. It's a concept that was created by a professor, John Powell. If you're not familiar with John Powell's work, I would strongly suggest you look into that. But in essence, what it talks about is we can set universal goals, right? We want Fairfax County to continue to thrive and be strong economically. Our schools are great. We can say, you know, those are the goals we hold. But if we are ultimately going to be successful, we have to disaggregate. We have to think about how each population is doing. We have to think about how every neighborhood is doing. And that's when we'll be able to see that not everyone is faring as well. And based on that, then we need to implement targeted strategies. And those targeted strategies are really aimed at overcoming structural inequity through the building of opportunity structures. And opportunities, again, are the things that all of us need to succeed. It's education, it's employment, it's transportation, it's healthy food, it's access to recreation and culture. But when you think about Fairfax County and you think about the different populations in the different places in Fairfax County, there is not equitable access to all of these opportunities. So the way that we are focusing our work on One Fairfax is in building opportunities in these areas. And this is just a sampling of the opportunity areas, but hopefully you can see it's really just opportunity, the same types of opportunities that we all need to succeed. And so just to close, these concepts are really about acknowledging that there is a difference in the levels of vulnerability and opportunity in our county. And so we have to start, this can't be a one size fits all cookie cutter approach to policy making. We have to address those differences. And we do that by targeting interventions that will build opportunity where it doesn't exist. Where opportunity does exist, and there may be barriers, and again, those barriers can be anything from lack of information, language access, transportation. However, there might be a barrier present, it should be a part of our work to understand what they are and seek to overcome them, again, in partnership with the community. And we also need to think about opportunity collectively in ways that it builds a path. And we like to think that everybody is here with the full intent and desire to support themselves, support their families, and contribute in meaningful ways to the community. We think about that as inclusive prosperity. And so the opportunities that we want to get people to have access to in Fairfax County are really intended to promote this idea of inclusive prosperity. And so now, hopefully, with the background laid by Marty and a better sense of what's going on in your own local community, just like to just say, think about how you approach your work moving forward. It's not about naming who is racist, right? It's about thinking about what's causing the racial inequities that we see. And our argument is that those racial inequities are not being caused by individual acts. Those racial inequities are being caused by institutions and structures, both within government and outside of government, right? So my role is really focused inside of government. There are these same types of outcomes and tendencies and trends seen through other institutions. Once we know, sort of have our focus on the institutions and structures, have a real sense of what the actions are that we're seeing. What are the impacts of those institutions and structures? Because that gives us a sense about how to begin to prioritize, and a sense of how to engage and who to engage with. Because our idea is that we need to be more proactive, right? We can't sort of look at these problems and allow them to happen because we're comfortable with the current social and structural arrangement. We have to have a problem with it, right? And then use our power, use our ability to organize and activate to address and be more proactive in terms of the development of strategies and solutions. So One Fairfax commits the county. So you live and worship in a county that has a commitment to intentionally consider equity, and hopefully you will hold us accountable to that. It's about fairness, right? Not about sameness. It's not about cutting this large pie in 9 equal pieces. It's about figuring out how the different areas and populations of the county are situated differently and targeting our approaches to that. It's acknowledging whether it can be difficult or not, that this is grounded in a history of racism and that race matters. We can't do this work if we don't acknowledge that the outcomes we see are racialized. Again, not about individual acts of bigotry while we discourage them. It's about realizing how institutions are perpetuating inequity and how we can overcome that through a focus on institutional and structural racism. While government plays a role, you also have a role, right? You have a role in holding your government accountable, but you also have a role in terms of looking at the systems and the structures that you hold power in, that you operate in, that you might gain advantage from, to see how they can be made more accessible to the community. And again, that is what will get us to this ultimate vision of One Fairfax. I'll share this presentation because it has some links to some of the things that I mentioned.
Let me take a picture. Hi, Karla. That was beautiful. We are going a little bit over time, but I love the way you went through and broke down equity. It's amazing. I had a quick question for you, Karla, since you're up right now, and we're a little bit over time right now. So I'm just going to ask you one question on the organization One Fairfax. What's the one for?
That's good. Because right now we see 2 Fairfaxes, this idea that there are really 2 sets of outcomes. There are outcomes where people are thriving and outcomes where people are being harmed. And we really want One Fairfax where everybody is on a path living to their ultimate, levels of success. So that's what we mean by one.
No, I love that, because we talk about unity, and I had some more questions, but I think we want to go to the breakouts. Before we go to breakouts, there is one question from Marty as well, and it's about opportunity zones. I think you talked about opportunity zones, and if you could just explain a little bit more what you meant by that.
I think it's zip codes, not zones. And, yeah.
Okay. I think there was a question asking for some more.
And so I think if you Google, opportunity zip codes or Raj Chetty, which is RAJCHETTY, you can come to, there's a lot of stuff on the web, summary of the research, detailed reports, charts, all kinds of stuff that describes what he means by that phrase. Okay.
Okay. So we are now going to go straight to breakout rooms because we are packed with information. We're ready to talk about what we just heard about. We just heard some beautiful, great information from both speakers. And I think Judith will now talk a little bit about the transition into breakout discussions. So Judith. Thank you, Marty. Thank you.
Thanks, and I'll try to do this really quickly so we can just get straight into it. We allocated 30 minutes for our small group discussions, and we're hoping that we really can give ourselves that amount of time. Each of the breakout groups will focus on only one of the 5 topics that we've identified, which you can see in this slide. So these are essentially the areas that we've been focusing on in our discussions: the education system, police and judicial systems, health services and healthy communities, housing, and community building. So when you go into a breakout room, you want to choose which of these 5 topics are you most interested in talking about today. All of the groups are going to be asked to address the same questions, which are how do you and or your faith community effect change through advocacy on policies or building relationships in the community or other strategies? what have you done so far, or what can you do? And the idea is to formulate and share your own action ideas for yourself as an individual and or for your house of worship or other community organization that you're involved in. Now, each of the groups is assigned a pre-designated facilitator who's going to select a member of the group to take notes and be prepared to give a very brief, just maybe 2-minute report on the key action ideas that emerge from the small groups discussion. We ask people to share any personal experiences they've had in doing this work, and any ideas for future actions, and try to identify for yourself at least one action, it could be large or small, that you can do as an instrument for disrupting racism.
The participants engaged in lively discussions in their breakout groups, and upon returning to the full group, began to report highlights of these discussions.
In our group, we had various people talk about their experiences, and the Sikh temple has been really excellent in terms of inviting them both on a personal level, inviting literally their neighbors all around them, and then opening their church to the entire community and doing outreach to students so that they understand more, high school students, college students, and the local neighbors, and trying very hard for the community to get together and understand one another and feel that we are one and the same, to quote that. Marie had suggested that one of the ways to deal with systemic racism in her church, they were able to read books by Alex Baldwin and Toni Morrison to get a sense of that and talk among themselves. To see what issues that we've all been brought up with in terms of racism. There was also another church did an outreach, the Grace Confident Church did an outreach about Grace Cares and outreach to the community, and making people aware of one another and building friendships that way and relationships that way and partnerships.
Okay, thank you. That's great. Who would like to go next? Anyone? I can't see the whole group though. Anybody? Just put your hand up. If not, I'm going to call on someone.
This is Harry. I've answered
Harry.
Joyce from the health.
Can you tell us really quickly which group you were in, the topic, and just if you haven't heard the points before, share some highlights about what you came up with.
Okay, it's Joyce from the health group that's going to report.
Okay.
Hi. I guess we put down a few bullet points. Educate people about risk factors. Sharing this was the health group. Sharing our resources. Am I blocking them? Maternal health disparities. Advocacy for individuals. Point out that it's in all of our self-interest to pursue health equity for everyone, and meaning the coronavirus puts it in stark detail that if we're not all vaccinated, the virus runs rampant, and specific to the vaccine, staying in your area generally, not going to poor areas and getting the vaccine.
Thank you, Joyce. Is that it?
That's it, unless somebody wants to add.
That's a lot of stuff there on health. That's good work. Anybody else would like to go from their group?
Marty?
So for education, Marty was reporting. Yeah.
Okay, Marty, you're up.
Okay, so the group includes almost everybody had some experience with circumstances where the church provided after-school support for kids. One was a local school in which there's mentoring, both individual children and then a support for classroom people. Another church was tutoring. Lutheran Social Services does both. It works both with individual children and then with the whole family. And then one of the participants talked about the needs of homeless students, which continue to be very great and are something that you can actually, although you can't necessarily change their circumstances, you can provide some of the needs that they
You
have
can jump off of that.
through the church.
Homeless students.
That's it.
Okay, and Marty, on the homeless students, I'm gonna let you report out on community building on that note. Thank you, Marty.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to report on community building off of Ms. Fazia Dean's iPad situation. So in our group, we had Manny, Melinda, Pammy, myself, Miriam, Fazia, and June and Rachel. And the common thread in our discussion, honestly, we ran out of time. So we went through introductions, but there was a lot of fruits from those introductions. Namely, everyone had their kind of concept tied back to being neighbors and being a neighbor and how that translates into community action. So in terms of June in her church, she has a book club that they're enacting diversity and looking into training and different sort of books that will, internalize that change. Rachel is actually a lawyer within which branch of the military?
Naval.
I believe the Navy. So she
Navy, yes.
Yeah, okay.
She's dead.
So she has been really enacting change in terms of the leadership there, and where it's preserved, that is presented as kind of a meritocracy. She's kind of pushing it more, or working on with her team, in terms of having different people of different colors, faiths, and obviously genders represented. Manny was a bit disappointed that even 16 years ago in 1960, the interfaith situation is still very similar. And it seems like there are a lot of people around the table that look the same, but are talking about either changes or in diversity, as well as, sorry guys, I'm drawing a blank, as well as, can you help me out?
No, just go to the next one.
Okay. And then in terms of Fazia and I also spoke about our work that we do with Justice for Juniors. In terms of our neighbors, we have a very diverse makeup in Bailey's Crossroads and Washington, D.C. And we work with mostly African-American, unfortunately juvenile incarcerated youth. And
mentorship.
We're doing mentorship. Sorry, she threw me out. We're going into the jail currently and mentoring and educating them about their legal kind of status, and just giving them motivation and education that they can enact real change in, and we're on the grounds doing that. So that's kind of what we spoke about now.
Thank you for that.
Now, our housing group, and Linda Blair is our reporter.
Thank you, Eleanor.
Linda.
I'm right here. We talked about white privilege and how that prevented at least two of us from seeing what went on when we were younger, because we had no way to know that it's only when we moved to this area or as we grew older that we noticed disparity. And Israel gave us an example of when he lived in New York. He's from New York, and he said people who live in poorer neighborhoods are usually neighborhoods of color, and they have no way out because they have poor credit, or they don't have jobs that can sustain them, and they without money, it's very difficult to move up or to move out. We talked a lot about churches trying to do to integrate communities and to help somehow. The idea of credit or bad credit is generally a problem for lower income families. And it's hard for them because they can't find housing because of credit checks. And if they have a negative credit check, they can't rent something, they surely can't buy something. And to make diverse populations feel welcome, or to help people with these bad credit checks or bad credit who are okay, really. We can support families with these problems by faith groups getting together to make these populations feel more welcome, and support families while they get on their feet. And one thing we talked about doing was faith groups joining together and talking to government agencies to see if there's a way to overcome the bad credit barrier so families can find housing. And also to get some kind of support along with that. Perhaps a faith-based group could co-sign for 1 year if the family is deserving, and they would, and maybe that would work. So it has to do with income. Housing has to do with income. Housing has to do with credit, and credit ratings that people can't get rid of. So
that's a mouthful. You guys did some good work in there. Wow. And you had you had a good group.
Yes.
Did you have something?
Can I add one thing to that?
Yes. Go ahead.
The one thing that I was thinking about, and also in addition to the government, is that we have a lot of different companies here that have control of multiple buildings across the board in the area. And so besides the actual possibility of working with government, there's also actually individually appealing to some of these companies that own a large swath of buildings in the area. So I think that's another thing that's worth exploring. And it's very hard to come up with this in 20 minutes or whatever the time period is. So we're spitballing, but I think all of that is worth discussing on the mechanism a little bit further.
And I have one more thing to say, and Israel brought this up too. Fairfax County is in new construction in trying to set aside places for lower income families. So you can find in buildings that are going up areas for families with lower incomes.
I love the use of the term spitballing. You can't really, we're trying to go so fast in trying to bring some relevance to these topics and how we can make change. So I appreciate all of you moving as quickly as you can through this.
We
started the police.
I just wanted to say one more thing. We think that One Fairfax, and we're lucky to have this, is doing a great job in trying to strategically design and plan communities to bring diversity and understanding and different economic groups together so they can access resources that will not isolate them from the ability to progress.
Thank you, and that's why we had Karla today.
Fazia.
Eric, you had another point.
Fazia.
Can you make it really quick?
No, the police group hasn't gone yet.
Okay, is
Steve,
that
can
your
you
group?
speak?
Yeah.
Yes, that is my group.
Everyone.
Steve,
Okay.
can you speak to that? Thanks.
Yes, sure. I've been
Thank
raising
you.
my hand, trying to get the opportunity.
Thank you. I didn't
in-
see your hand. Sorry about that.
No problem. In the interest of time, we had a marvelous and inspiring group and a really a robust conversation. The one idea in particular that I wanted to try to squeeze in, I know we're out of time here, includes a suggestion perhaps for ICD, and that was we had a really interesting conversation about the value in having individual citizens get a firsthand experience of our criminal justice system, and people who are not themselves part in some way of the system have no sense of what that's like. If we're going to make impacts in changing things, there might be great value in actually finding some mechanism for gaining that firsthand experience of it. The suggestion was made that maybe ICD could do something to create an opportunity for citizens to, in some fashion, get a firsthand experience of how the criminal justice system in Fairfax County works.
Are you thinking more like ride-alongs? Are you thinking more of a seminar, education by the police themselves? Because we did have a webinar on that.
I guess for me, my interpretation of the conversation, we didn't get too far in the way of identifying how concretely what that might look like, but I sort of heard it as a ride along into the court system not a ride along with
Okay.
the police per se. This was focused on the criminal justice system as a whole.
And that just ties into the Justice for Juniors work that we do, but we're out of time to even peel that onion. But I know that ICD is planning to do more work on this, and stay tuned. Judith is going to talk a little bit about our resources that we're going to send out to everyone. And in the coming days, ICD will also share our action points that emerge out of the session and links to the workshop recordings. And we want all of you here today to be change agents, building on the tools, the knowledge from these workshops. I want to leave a word of action, a little tiny story. I'm going to just break it. When a baby is born, and we can all relate to this, those parents in the room, when a baby is born, how do they get your attention? When they're hungry, they scream. When they scream, you react. That is action. It's a very basic action. And I want you to remember, when we are frozen in our seats because we're worried about how people will look at us, the way to think about action is, if you stay quiet and you see something that needs changing and you don't say anything, then it doesn't get changed. And we've had 400 years of that. So we're hoping to see you all as change agents. Take action. Remember that when the baby's hungry or it needs your attention, it will scream. And what do? You react. And that's what we're doing. That's what we're doing right now. The protest, I'm not saying that's for everyone, reading books, but then after you read the book, do an action with it. And like Mr. Heller just said, ride along into the justice court system, taking action. What do? I have a book club. How can I take this book club to the next level? Let's do a field trip. Go to the museum together of redlining. There's a redlining museum. Marty talked about the zoning. And then you heard so much about One Fairfax. And with that, I would also like to take 1 second to thank all the women on the panel today. And I'm especially pulling out the women, Judith and everyone who pulled this together and who participated in facilitating and putting this action together, these events together, because it's Women's History Month. And on that note, I'm going to hand it over to Judith. Thank you all for participating, and I hope to see you. Look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.
So thanks so much. And I want to add my thanks to everyone who participated. I think we've learned so much in this and in our previous sessions. And I hope that everyone takes something from this and as Fazia said, moves forward. We will be, again, as we've done in the past, sending out a feedback survey. We really appreciate any comments that you can give us about how these programs went for you. We'll also be sharing, we've been gathering resources all along, and we're pulling them together, and we'll pull together ideas out of this session. So our expectation is that we'll be sharing the wealth of resources that we've gathered. And then we would also like to check back with everybody who participated in about 6 to 8 weeks from now to ask you to tell us what you've done. Are there actions that you've taken, whether they're things that you planned before or things that you were inspired to do because of these workshops? Share with us your experiences. We'll try to share them back out with other people and just keep the ball rolling. So that's our hope. And with that, once again, my thanks to Fazia and all of the planning group and all of the attendees. And I'd like to just give Pammy the floor to close it out.
I want to add thanks not only to the participants, but particularly to Marty and Karla for getting us a huge amount of information that we needed to digest. So special thanks to you for leading the discussion. It's very clear that we need to continue this work in different ways, whether it's part of the working group or as ICD or in partnership with others. So we have resources in the Fairfax community, One Fairfax and others that we hope to continue to collaborate with. So I just want to say that this is not the end of the work that we will do on racism, hopefully. We will continue to do this, and we look forward to your participation as both as members of the ICD community and also in your own work help us to do better in this area and other areas that we work on. So thanks all for participating in this series of workshops. And I want to conclude by saying we have two people that I especially want to thank for the work that we've done, and that's Judith and Fazia. Maybe you should put the spotlight on them rather than anybody else. They're the ones who led this work from the beginning, and they've done a huge amount of work behind the scenes, and there's no way we can thank them enough. So those are the two, plus others who will join them as we go forward. So thank you very much, Judith, Fazia, and the working group, the steering committee, all members who facilitated the work today and in previous workshops. My heartfelt thanks to all of you. We really are very grateful to have your contributions. So let me close with that, and we'll continue our discussions, and please join us when we have next workshop. Thank you.
This has been a workshop on building bridges for racial equity. It was the final workshop in a 4-part series presented by the Interfaith Communities for Dialogue. We hope you will continue to join the ICD in learning, sharing, and taking action to disrupt systemic racism, and we thank you. To view other workshop videos in this series, click on the playlist button below. To subscribe to our channel and receive notifications of new videos, click on the subscribe button below.